In this video, we'll set up triggers and interaction. We'll use Unity's standard 2D character controller, but the same process applies to 3D and other character controllers. First, make sure you've imported Unity's standard 2D assets. Then, in a new scene, add the platform 36x1 prefab. Set its position to -20, 0, 0. Add character Robot Boy and set its position to 0, 2, 0. Add a sprite. Name it Box 1. This will be our first NPC. Assign a texture. Set its position to 4, 1, 0. And add a box collider 2D. We'll do the same for our second NPC, which we'll call Box 2. And now we'll add the dialog system components. Add the Dialog Manager prefab. Assign the dialog database from the demo scene. Then inspect Box 1. Add a dialog actor component. Assign a Bark UI prefab to the Bark UI field. This prefab will be instantiated at runtime. Set the offset to 110. We'll use a trigger collider to interact. Add a box collider 2D. Set the size to 5. And tick is trigger. Finally, add a dialog system trigger. Set the trigger dropdown to on trigger enter. Click add player tag so that only the player can trigger it. And in the actions section, choose bark. The bark action can bark from a conversation source or literal text. In this case, we'll bark some literal text. Choose text and set bark text to hello. Let's test this out. We'll walk up to the box and it says hello. Next, we'll set up a proximity selector to interact with Box 2. Add a usable component. This marks it as usable by selectors and proximity selectors. Then add a dialog system trigger, leave it at onUse, and select Start Conversation. Then choose the Sergeant Graves conversation. That does it for Box 2. Now we need to set up the player. We'll set up a trigger collider for the proximity selector. We'll position it just in front of the player. And add a proximity selector. Since space is mapped to jump, we'll map the E key to the use function. and we'll add a selector use standard UI so that it can use the standard UI elements. Otherwise, it will use legacy ongoing. So I forgot to set the trigger to isTrigger. Now we'll play again, and we can see that the proximity selector detects box 2, and we can interact with it. You may notice one thing. You can still move around while the conversation is playing. In many cases, you can use a dialog system events component to disable player control during conversations. You can also use it to disable the proximity selector during conversations. For example, you could set the onConversationStart and onConversationEnd events to disable the player's Platformer 2D user control. Unfortunately, this won't always suffice. In the case of the 2D controller, the player's animator will continue to play animations based on its animator parameter values. If the player were running when you press the E key, the player would continue to play the run animation. The solution is to also add a dialog system trigger to the player. Set the trigger to onConversationStart. And add an action to play a sequence. Set the sequence to animator float speed, 0. This will set the speed parameter to 0. Now when we interact, we see that the proximity selector's UI disappears and the player hits an idle pose. If you prefer to handle this in code instead, you can add a script with onConversationStart and onConversationEnd methods as described in the manual. The proximity selector and selector components are very versatile. You can move the trigger colliders to the usable objects instead of the player if you prefer. Proximity selector works with trigger colliders. Selector, on the other hand, runs a raycast. You can configure the selector to raycast from the mouse position, or the center of the screen, which is useful for first-person controllers, or a custom source. The selector and proximity selector are also entirely optional. You can use your own interaction functionality if you prefer. And that's it for this video.